no two companies will ever find product market fit in the same way, using the same tools and in the same time frame. Every one of these processes is an art, but there's also a lot of commonality to them. As I've now invested in nearly 40 companies since I started Stage, and I get the outside view on helping 40 companies through that journey, I have developed a pretty fundamental level of knowledge and expertise about what this takes. As I always tell founders, my job is to sort of get you to 20 people and $2 million of ARR and your Series A. And I am often then handing the board seat off to the later stage investors who are the experts at getting you from 2 million of ARR to 20 to 200. And all of my attention is directed in that very early, very unstructured part of the life of a company.